Mrs. Ada Harris is a fairly aging woman who lives in London. She believes in luck and loves what she does. She is a cleaner of 3 different houses. Her friend, Violet Butterfield, also works as a cleaner. One evening after a long day of work, the 2 friends go to a bar. Mr. Archie offers to buy them a drink so he can be in their company. Mrs. Harris then shows Violet a package she received from the military for some time now but is scared to open it. Violet tells her to open it and accept whatever comes in the package. When she opens it, she finds her husband's ring and a letter which reads that her husband was killed in combat. The news of her husband's death crushed her, but she encouraged herself and moved on with her life. The next day at work in Lady Dant's house, while assembling her clothes, Mrs. Harris comes across a beautiful dress. She goes close to it and admirably touches it. Lady Dant enters the room saying she bought the dress for £500 from a Christian Dior shop in Paris. When Lady Dant leaves, Mrs. Harris goes to the mirror with the dress, daydreaming herself wearing a beautiful dress like that. She goes home still thinking about the dress and then she stakes a bet. The next day, Mrs. Harris and Violet listen to the scores on the radio. Violet is embarrassed listening to the scores. She takes their tickets and proceeds to burn them. Mrs. Harris stops her immediately saying she has won. Violet celebrates her friend and then asks her what she'll be using the money for. She replies that she'll be using it to get a beautiful dress from Christian Dior for the upcoming Legion dance. Days passed and since the money from the pool wasn't enough, she started to find new jobs in addition to the old ones in order to save more for the dress, a passport and other travel expenses for her Paris trip. One day while working in Lady Dant's house, she asks about her salary for last month so she can add up to her money for Paris. Lady Dant tells her to wait until next week. She also adds that she will reduce her working hours because they all have to economize these days. Mrs. Harris walks home in the rain feeling worried about what Lady Dant told her. Suddenly, she finds sparkling jewelry, picks it up and takes it to the police station. At home, while Mrs. Harris is mending her clothes, Violet walks in saying Mr. Archie has got them tickets to the dog racing event. Mrs. Harris doesn't want to go but Violet takes her along by force. At the game, Mrs. Harris sees a dog on number 6 and says it's a sign. She then goes on to bet all her money on it. Mr. Archie tries convincing her not to, but she doesn't pay heed to it. During the game, we see the dog on number 6 taking the lead but suddenly stops for no reason and loses the game. Mrs. Harris and her friend stay back after the game to grieve about their loss. Mr. Archie walked to them and shared some experiences he also had when he first came to London. At home, Mrs. Harris watched her Paris dream come to an end as she tore the sheets she recorded her savings in. Later while in bed, she hears a knock on her door. The man is from the military. He is there to let her know about Mr. Harris' wealth, as the law demands. At the same time, Violet also goes to her house with a policeman. He is there to give her a reward for returning the jewelry. Today is her lucky day. Just when she's taking him in, Mr. Archie also comes around to give her money. Mr. Archie took part of the money she bet with and placed a bet on the last race and won. As he gives her the money, he asks her to dance with him at the Legion. The next day, Mrs. Harris sets off to Paris to get her dress. She spends the night at the station with 3 French men. The next day, one of them takes her to the house of Dior. Just when she's about to enter, a model named Natasha runs in her way and falls down. She helps her back on her feet and realizes she left her purse on the floor. Mrs. Harris runs after her with her luggage until she meets her and returns it. The lady thanks her and rushes back into a room. She is a model for Christian Dior. Mrs. Harris gets to the reception. Claudine doesn't pay attention to her and hands the others their tickets to go inside. Mrs. Harris feels something is wrong somewhere. She tells Claudine she's also there to buy a dress, but Claudine still doesn't listen and tells Mr. Forval, the accountant, and Marguerite to take her to a shop where she can afford a dress. Mrs. Harris resists the prejudice as Mr. Forval tries getting close to her. She starts to narrate how hard she has had to work to save for a Dior dress, but Claudine tells her his place is not for her and she can't afford a Dior dress. She then reaches into her bag and brings out all her $500 savings. A man from the queue named Marquis sees how eager Mrs. Harris wants to get a dress and takes her inside. As his guest to see the collection of dresses, he hands her a small book and tells her to write down the number of dresses she has an interest in. Mrs. Harris asks him if he came to buy his wife a dress, but unfortunately the man's wife is dead. He's just there to see the dresses and the models. Madame Avalon, a rich and mean woman with her daughter, takes their seats beside her. Soon, the show begins and Mrs. Harris falls in love with a green dress. When she asks for the number to write it down, the rich woman also writes the same number down with an evil smile on her face. Mrs. Harris chooses dress number 89, Temptation, over the first one she showed interest in. The rich woman, seeing that, also writes the number 89 down. After the show, Mrs. Harris tells Marguerite she wants the temptation dress, but when Madame Avalon sees her with Marguerite, she calls her and tells her she wants the same dress. Marguerite offers her apologies to Mrs. Harris and tries to convince her to settle for the other one she wrote down earlier. When she insists on the temptation dress, they tell her they'll sew her another one in 2 weeks, but she's worried about the work she has left behind and where she'll be spending the next 2 weeks at. Mr. Forval tells her to send a telegram to someone to cover her job for her, and then he offers his place for her to stay with him for the meantime since his sister isn't around. They start taking measurements for her dress. Natasha offers to take her to Mr. Forval's place. Mrs. Harris asks if she is friends with him and she says no, she only knows him as the man that signs her check. Natasha drives her around Paris and later takes her to Mr. Forval's. The two clean up the mess in the house and Mrs. Harris cooks dinner. Mr. Forval comes home and is surprised to see Natasha. They later sit and dine together. The next day, Mr. Forval takes Mrs. Harris with him to work to have her dress fitted. After they finish for the day, Marguerite gets into a conversation with Mrs. Harris and ends up telling her the house's secret. They're going through financial crises. Mrs. Harris meets Marquis outside and he takes her to a florist. He buys her a flower to attach to her Dior dress when it's done. Later that night, Marquis later takes her to a restaurant. They ate, drank and had a wonderful time watching the ladies dance. Natasha sees Mrs. Harris and joins her for some minutes. She is there with some investors of Dior, though she doesn't want to be doing that always. She prefers to stay at home and read a book instead. After Natasha leaves them, they drink and dance into the night. Mrs. Harris wakes up late for fitting the next day. When she gets to the house, Monsieur Carr refuses to continue with her dress. Mrs. Harris pleads with Claudine to make him continue, but she rather makes the situation worse. After the incident, Marguerite drinks with her and takes her to the place where the magic is done. She walks through it amazed at how neatly and orderly the dresses are made. Claudine comes to the workshop and sees Mrs. Harris busily sewing a button to a dress. She gets furious and takes her to the office to bombard her with insults. As her outbursts continue, Natasha comes in with flowers from Marquis for her and a message requesting that she visit his place for tea tomorrow. Out of jealousy, Claudine tells her Marquis doesn't receive people like her. At night Mr. Forval takes Mrs. Harris on a walk. He tells her he has ways of bringing back the house of Dior to its feet, but Claudine will not take it into consideration. On their way, they see a famous actor and Natasha attending a movie premiere. The actor kisses Natasha in the process. Mr. Forval is in love with Natasha, so seeing her with another man breaks his heart. But Mrs. Harris tries to make Mr. Forval feel okay by telling him they're just acting. But he still thinks he doesn't stand a chance in her life. The next day after Mrs. Harris fitting, Marquis takes her to his house for breakfast. He shows her pictures of him when he was little and attending a boarding school. He again showed her the cleaner whom he felt at ease with and tells Mrs. Harris she reminds him of that cleaner. Mrs. Harris broke down hearing that, because she was thinking all this time that he had feelings for her. She dried up her tears and went for her last fitting the next day. Upon reaching there, she sees some models and other employees leaving the house with sad faces. When she learns Claudine fired them because of the house's financial problems, she marches them back inside and calls Mr. Forval along to let Mr. Dior know the idea he has that can save the house. In Mr. Dior's office, Mr. Forval tells him it's time he adds accessories, perfumes, bags and other things in the fashion world to his brand and lower the prices so that the low-class people can also purchase them. When he finds his idea pleasing, he orders everyone to leave the office including Claudine so that he can talk privately with Mr. Forval. When they are done with their conversation, Mr. Forval gives them the good news that instead of losing their jobs, they'll be needing more hands. Claudine walks away in shame and packs her things to leave. Mr. Forval and Mrs. Harris go to her house later in the evening. They apologize for embarrassing her in front of everyone and tell her their intentions were just to save the house of Dior from sinking. Mrs. Harris tells her how good she is at her job and the need for her to return. Claudine accepts to return, and as they leave, Mrs. Harris urges Mr. Forval to let Natasha know tomorrow that he has feelings for her. Claudine does them a favor by telling them Natasha is leaving Paris to chase her dreams. They start searching for her until they find her at the station. Mr. Forval professes his feelings for her and they share a kiss. The next day Mrs. Harris tries her dress on and now returns to England with it. At night while she's doing the dishes, one of the ladies she worked for, Penrose, comes in complaining about what she's going to wear to a dinner party with her producer because what she planned to wear is stained. The kind-hearted Mrs. Harris calms her down and lends her the Dior dress. Penrose thanks her for the deed and sets out to attend the dinner party. The next day, Mrs. Harris goes to Penrose's house to clean it up and take her dress, but when she arrives, she sees that the dress is burnt and there is a letter of apology and a narration of how the dress got burnt. That night, Violet visits her and shows her the news on the dress that got burnt. She then hugs her and tells her everything will be all right. Mrs. Harris returns her work. When she gets to Lady Dant's house, she asks her to pay back all that she owes her because she intends to quit working for her. While at home, she hears a knock on the door and answers it. It's a package from Christian Dior and a letter from Claudine appreciating her for bringing the house of Dior back to life. Madame Avalon couldn't pay for her dress because her husband's assets were seized by the authorities for stealing from his workers. Mrs. Harris's measurement was then used to make her the temptation dress she had longed for. Marquis also sent flowers to mark their friendship. Mr. Forville and Natasha also thank her for bringing them together. Mrs. Harris wears the dress to the dance that night. When she arrives, everyone turns to catch a sight of her in the beautiful dress. Archie compliments her for her stunning looks and later dances with her as the movie ends.